The content discussed in this episode may be specific to the guest's organisation or location and may not be applicable to other organisations, states, territories or countries. The material presented in this podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be considered health, legal or financial advice. Medical administration is a rewarding profession, but it comes with challenges. So what is it like, and what should you do if confronted with a monumental administrative difficulty? This is the podcast that takes unfortunate scenarios and explores the essentials of clinical governance to find solutions. I'm Dr David Rankin, a very experienced medical administrator and lead fellow with the Royal Australasian College of Medical Administrators. And this is Safeguarding Healthcare, the essentials of clinical governance. Today, an underperforming practitioner and political priorities.
This is quite an extreme path, or it's a last resort path.
That's Professor Alan Sandford, the Director of Medical Academic Development, Regional Medical Pathway at Central Queensland and Wide Bay Hospital and Health Services. And I'm presenting him with a difficult scenario.
We have a much higher responsibility, and that is to our patients, families and communities.
In today's scenario, you have become aware that a medical staff member whose clinical performance and behaviour you believe falls below an acceptable standard. You meet with the doctor and outline the basis of your concerns, indicating that you will be recommending that their credentials be withdrawn and that you feel obliged to report your concerns to APRA. Several hours later, you receive an email from the non-clinical CEO, who indicates that your intended course of action would be unacceptable, that the doctor is a high-profile practitioner who attracts patients from across the state, and any adverse action could result in considerable reputational damage to the hospital. The doctor is also well connected politically, and the CEO does not want any political interference. You believe the doctor's practice is putting patient safety at risk. I start by asking Professor Alan Sandford what issues this scenario raises.
The issue that it raises, which is first and foremost to us as medical leaders, is of course patient safety. Patient and our obligation as medical practitioners and particularly as medical leaders is to ensure patients are treated safely and effectively. And that is our guiding principle in the roles that we undertake in whatever aspect of the health service. This particular scenario, as you've outlined it, is a troubling one because there is a situation in which a doctor has deviated from that which we would see acceptable. And the deviation is because of the concerns that we as a practitioner have about patient safety, which is really a sacrosanct principle of which we need to adhere always.
You're in a real tension. You're employed by the hospital, so the chief executive's your boss, but on the other hand, as a medical administrator and a medical practitioner, you have an obligation to ensure patient safety. How do you resolve this tension between your role as an employee of the hospital and your role as a doctor to protect patient safety?
Whilst our employment arrangements are to do with, the human resources and the way that we're retained, still, ultimately, we're employed in roles to undertake a particular task as medical leaders, and that is to maintain system integrity and safety for our patients. So whilst we may be employed by a particular entity, we have a much higher responsibility, and that is to our patients, families and community. So irrespective of our employment status. Now, that doesn't mean that that is to be dismissed or isn't considered, but it never becomes the principle upon which we are engaged, because We work as professionals and we have a professional code and practice and standards that we uphold. Should we abandon those for self-interest, really, which is that of our employment status and therefore our income or whatever it happens to be, then I think that we're in an awful situation where essentially the very basis of us being medical practitioners, in this instance, the important role and the custodianship of being a medical leader, is abandoned. So I certainly consider that that is a matter of the employment, but ultimately there is a far greater responsibility that I think that we adhere to.
So who in a hospital has final authority on who is granted credentialing or ability to work at the hospital?
Ultimately, the determination of credentialing and the determination of scope of practice is overseen by the medical leader. The medical leader, by virtue of the appropriately and compliantly constituted credentials committee with the appropriate governance structure in place, it's the committee and the determination and the results. So those that are part of such a governance body need to be satisfied, and they come to a point where the granting of a particular scope of practice and indeed the credentialing, and in some instances, although it varies a little bit, the appointment to that facility is determined. So it is overseen by the single medical leader. It may be the credentials chair. The credentials chair may report through to another medical leader, but ultimately it is absolutely a clinical responsibility and decision. I would suggest that any chief executive or other executive that may be in part in the organisational structure would be ill-advised to move and or rule against that. So I think it is clearly a clinical decision. That is what the medical leadership and clinical governance frameworks have in place, irrespective whether it is public, private, not whatever domain, that's the arrangement. So it is a clinical and medical decision.
Usually it's a function of the directors, so the board, to be the ultimate determinant of quality and safety issues. The board will often delegate that responsibility down. Do you as a medical leader have the ability to appeal to the board if you're uncomfortable with the chief executive's determination?
The board or the governing body of any organisation is indeed the overarching authority, but it is not a single person, it is a board. That's one of the bases of good governance in any setup. If there was a decision that was being made by a delegate, if I can use that determination because we're talking about delegated authority, that was otherwise contrary to that which would be acceptable at a more global level, then yes, there would be an opportunity, as there should always be, to appeal such a decision. That is what a governing body, they would then take the evidence, they would take the information and the advice, and they would then make a determination. So I think this is the strength of having a governance framework. Otherwise, you just have a dictatorship and an autocratic system, which we would not adhere to.
Absolutely, yeah. Doctors don't work in isolation. The other staff that this doctor works with, his colleagues, nursing staff, allied health staff, have all observed his practice and likely come to the same conclusion that you have, that his practice is putting patient safety at risk. How do you assure the other staff in the hospital that you're taking appropriate action when you've got this tension with the chief executive?
David, you're absolutely right. No doctor should ever work in isolation, irrespective of whether they have the title of the consultant. They may have leadership responsibilities, but we all work in a team. We rely upon that team. We interact with that team. We are observed by that team. And the instance you've described is where there may be observations which are deviating from that which a number of people may see as acceptable. And indeed, in this instance, is about safety. So The governance structures and the clinical governance frameworks that we have within our respective organisations include processes which have peer review, which they have multidisciplinary teams, and a variety of different mechanisms by which we monitor and collect data and observe and record performance. So in this instance, I would be very carefully looking at, first of all, that this is not hearsay and that these are not comments that are coming from an area where there are likes, dislikes, etc. But I'd want firm information about what is being said here. And then in terms of assuring those that are in the team, and that is once you've determined, yes, there is a general view and there's evidence that would support the views being formed by others, that there is an appropriate action. The clinical governance framework gives us that mechanism by which our action is taken. That interfaces with our human resources system, which is the more general system, but clinical governance looks at clinical quality, safety, and performance. That is done essentially and most powerfully by peers, but is also informed by those others within the team. And I would be engaging the clinical reviews, the mortality, morbidity, the surgical theatres, a variety. There are all sorts of different ways that that information is collected and used. And it's important that it is used. It's not window dressing. It's there for a very good reason. It protects not only the public and the patient, but it also protects the individual practitioner. In this instance, it would be protecting this practitioner as well as those that are working within the organisation and the reputation. They're all interlinked. So I think that I would be enacting the clinical governance framework mechanisms, be carefully looking at what is being exhibited, what the measures are, and addressing that. It would be very sad and regretful if we got to a stage where a practitioner had deviated to such an extent, unless it was a sudden deviation, that they got to such a significant extent that there was a consideration of a report to AHPRA. To me, this would indicate that the clinical governance framework has not been enacted to that which it's there for, and that is to protect people. So I would hope that in this instance, the signs that things may have been deviating should have been picked up earlier. And indeed, we should then have assisted that practitioner. And as a medical leader, our job is to advocate, to assist and to support, in addition to the more global role that we have in protecting the patients and their families, ensuring patient care is delivered safely and effectively. So I would look at, okay, what are we doing here? What can we do before jumping to conclusions and or rash? Well, perhaps rash might be, but I would carefully consider what actions I might take and at what stage.
Alan, the CEO has responded with an email. Is an email appropriate communication in this complex scenario?
David, in this scenario, there's communication between the chief executive and the medical leader, which is an email. This always bothers me. In this instance, I would certainly not rely just on an email. I would have a discussion with the chief executive. I would let the chief executive know, as a part of good governance, that I have a concern. But I would not just let them know I had a concern. I would let them know that I'd collected information and what sort of actions I might put in place before going down the path of being compelled to report such a practitioner to the regulators, because this is quite an extreme path, or it's a last resort path. The other is the Credentials Committee. The Credentials Committee and those that come together, and they're wise people that provide the appropriate advice, are also a source of protection, and they provide solutions. So rather than just being police people, they should be used as a resource in order to guide, in order to fulfill their obligation, which is to protect. And that is protect the clinician as well as protect the patient and the organisation. So I'd be looking to the Credentials Committee for a mechanism by which we could remediate this situation. And that would include drawing upon the peers within the Credentials Committee and indeed the peers of this particular individual to assist in providing support in order to remediate, not to punish or to exclude. I think this, indeed, we may come to that, but I'm not sure that I would be at that stage in doing this.
Extremely important. I think fundamental principle of clinical governance is coaching rather than policing.
Yes.
Situations like this are enormously stressful. Who would you reach out to help you think through the scenarios and your options?
Look, the role of a medical leader is oftentimes stressful because we deal with difficult things. It's part of what we do. I also firmly believe, and you and I have had this discussion before, that the role of the medical leader can only be successful if we are supported by peers. And so, indeed, who I would reach out to, and this is a very careful and thoughtful process by which we reach out in a confidential fashion. We can clearly de-identify, etc., but I would seek the wise counsel of peers. There's twofold reason for that. One is actually looking after self, because as you say, these situations are very stressful, but a key to our performance is making sure that we pay attention to self first and foremost. So it's the peer support that is provided from the peer. The second is to use the peer as another lens, as another person that you can field questions and for them to likewise question you so that you can go through in a more comprehensive way whatever the issue is that's before you that may be leading to this anxiety and the troubling nature of that. And so the peer can provide a sounding board, but also a knowledgeable base upon which you can then formulate decisions that you as an individual must make. I'm not suggesting abrogating responsibility, but providing as much support as well as advice to enable you to make an informed decision about what to do next. Often in exploring different scenarios, but if I did this, this would occur, etc., is a very useful thing rather than doing the sudden reactive response. And we all know as medical leaders the hazards that are involved when one makes a reaction response to such a matter, which are almost invariably complex.
I think that's critically important. Peers can often provide quite a different perspective on the situation you've got yourself into. Alan, a scenario like this opens itself up to whistleblowing, going beyond the chief executive. And there's probably several levels. There's, as we talked about, the board, but then the hospital's licensed by the state. Under what circumstances would you consider whistleblowing?
Whistleblowing is, David, I think almost the very last option. If all other avenues of appealing to reason and gathering information and data have failed, then we get to this point. Unfortunately, the experience would show, and I think across the world, that in whistleblowing and situations where it has deteriorated to such a length, there are rarely any winners. So there is a situation where a number of people are going, which is why I would leave it as the very last resort, because oftentimes the whistleblower, in fulfilling their action, we know ends up in a situation where the two are harmed. Anyway, it's not a good end to get to. So I would certainly look towards, and again, slightly going back, is all of the mechanisms before you get to that point. In this scenario, the chief executive is clearly interested in ensuring that the functionality, the productivity of the organisation is upheld, because you've got a highly productive and a reputable, in terms of, well, a high profile, shall I say, rather than reputable, because that's relative, practitioner. But at the same time, I would be speaking to the chief executive saying that the reputation of the organisation is not just going to be harmed because that individual is being constrained, but it may be much more profoundly affected in a negative sense if indeed it remains unattended or unaddressed. So I think that the sorts of things I would be having a discussion, not an email, with the chief executive is the risks to the chief executive and ultimately to the governing body and the board if actions are not taken to try and rectify a situation which is rapidly, well, perhaps in this instance, not so rapidly, but has been deteriorating to the extent that now it seems that patient safety is being adversely affected. So I would always go back to remediation, the presenting of information to try and rectify the situation before getting to the more extreme state. In the political aspect, and it raises the political aspect, and all of us experience, well, we live in a political environment. The same thing applies. The politicians, whoever they are, whether they be local or federal, whatever, have constituencies. Those constituencies are the public. They're not dissimilar. In fact, they're the same as the constituencies that ultimately we have. As medical leaders, our role is to provide services to and to protect the public in terms of the service delivery safely and effectively. So they are not misaligned. Sometimes in scenarios like this, they can be ill-informed, in which case they can go down a path. So in effect, we are obliged to protect the political leader here, because if the political was pushing a particular pragmatic and or a direct outcome that they thought was good, then they could indeed be damaging themselves. And I think, again, it's important for us to raise. If it meant me speaking to the political individual that may have been involved, that may have been mobilised by this highly visible and reputable practitioner within the community, I would inform them so that they understood the potential of the outcomes that they're suggesting. I would hope that they may consider their political response in the light of that, because ultimately it can adversely affect them as well. At the end of the day, an adverse outcome and patient harm is affecting negatively everybody. So it affects the CEO, it affects the board, the politician. And my role as a medical leader would be to show the hazards if we do not put in place the checks, if we do not enact our clinical governance, and we do not therefore protect the public as well as the practitioner.
One of the tragic consequences, and we've all seen it amongst our colleagues, is the medical leader resigns. It's just too hard. The conflict is intolerable. However, resignation doesn't solve the problem. You've still got this practitioner practicing in a way that's unsafe for patient outcomes. Can you talk to us about the option of resignation and the pros and cons? At what point would that be something you'd consider?
Again, it's a regretful end point. If we're at the stage where the medical leader feels they must resign, part of that may be self-protection. And I come back to the importance of protection of self. So I have a credo: the most important person in my life is me, because if I don't look after me, I'm no use to anyone else. So if we get to the stage where this practitioner has explored every option, they are not able to do that, and it becomes adversely affecting them, then they may feel compelled, in order to survive. Finally, it is a survival point to exit that situation, because the other consequence is the significant damage and harm it can do to the individual. Now, if they've got to that stage, then resignation may be an endpoint in order to take them away from ongoing harm. It is very regretful because it does not address the problem. It is basically taken out an individual who has raised the fact that there is an issue here, and that then remains unchecked. The organisation is vulnerable. The practitioner may be out of the picture because, and then therefore, well, they're not necessarily protected because it's very hard to totally wash one's hands, but at least they may have taken themselves away from the immediate harm. But the organisation hasn't. And so there may be a false sense that they are then able to go along with the somewhat self-interested path, but at the end of the day, the issues that are underpinning patient safety will not be rectified, and ultimately it is likely that something further and adverse and bad will happen.
It's one of the nightmare scenarios for any medical leader. Any final thoughts or observations about a scenario like this?
Ensuring that we have in place all of the things that we have so skillfully brought together in having a robust clinical governance environment to provide medical leadership that is both monitoring but also supportive of our practitioners, and not letting things get to a point where we need to step in and make interventions at the last minute. Sometimes that does occur, but I'm very much of the view that there's always a path where rectification and remediation is possible. The end point of having to cease, terminate, or stop, etc., is just that. It's an end point which is regretful. So I think preparation and ensuring integrity of clinical governance frameworks, ensuring the integrity, authority of the medical leader, and we often see situations where governance environments blur the authority, but it must not. No organisation should allow the integrity of the system, and that includes the empowered medical leader to take the appropriate actions. So preparation and maintenance of the system, maintaining a contemporary overview of what's taking place in the facility is what I would stress in this scenario and any scenarios where there's potential of patient harm.
Thank you, Alan. Extraordinary discussion on a very difficult scenario at so many levels.
Thank you very much, David. It's always good to talk.
That's Professor Alan Sandford, the Director of Medical Academic Development, Regional Medical Pathway at Central Queensland and Wide Bay Hospital and Health Services. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Safeguarding Healthcare. I'm Dr David Rankin. Follow Safeguarding Healthcare free on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. This podcast is produced by Sound Cartel for the Royal Australasian College of Medical Administrators.